They say humanity doesn't belong out here, not on the edge of dying planets, not in frozen wind that slices through armor like paper, not in places where even the sun seems too tired to rise, and yet here we are again, clinging to warmth like it's sacred, which maybe it is. I didn't come here to save anyone. I came because a signal went silent, and someone had to answer it, and when I dropped into that frozen hellscape, I figured I'd find bodies, wreckage, a statistic to file and forget. I did not expect to find her, or the child, or the choice that would tear open everything I thought I knew about what it means to be human, and what it means to be seen as one. This is not a story about war, or glory, or the kind of heroism you write into textbooks. This is about a man, a mother, a child, and a planet that tried very hard to make sure none of us walked away from it. It is about noise, and fire, and the refusal to let silence win. It is about what happens when someone who is supposed to walk past decides, instead, to kneel beside, and offer the last of their heat. This is the story of the frozen ones, and how we melted something bigger than the ice. They said this planet had no name, only a designation Eldoris 6, because apparently no one ever cared enough to call it something you could say without biting your tongue. It wasn't supposed to matter, just a frozen rock on the edge of a quiet arm of the galaxy, where the most exciting thing that ever happened was the wind screaming like it had something personal against your ears. That was before the evacuation. That was before the snowdrifts buried entire shuttles and before the communications tower cracked like a dead tooth. That was before I found the bodies. Or more specifically, the body that wasn't yet a body, and the smaller one barely clinging to her chest. My name is Dane Kelly, Lieutenant First Class, Earth Recon and Rescue, though that part felt a little ridiculous when you're stuck solo on an ice cube that wants you dead with a kind of intimate intensity. My last official order was to locate survivors after the failed extraction of the refugee colony. The thing about failed is that it's a very polite word for we didn't show up and they all died. I wasn't supposed to be here alone. The rest of my unit was spread across 3 search pods, 2 of which I watched slam into ice ridges while mine did a pirouette into a snowbank and somehow didn't explode. I climbed out with a dislocated shoulder, a busted transmitter, and a heating unit that wheezed like a dying animal. Good times. I spent the first 48 hours trying to stabilize the pod, collect rations, and convince myself that this was just another delay, not a death sentence. The 3rd night, I stopped pretending. The 4th morning, I started walking. The 5th, I found them. It was a ravine, the kind of place that shouldn't even exist on this flat glacier hell, a narrow crack in the white world that plummeted deep enough to swallow light. I saw something, though, a flash of purple against the blue-white snow, so faint I thought my eyes were frosting over. I climbed down. Slipped twice. Cursed 3 times. At the bottom, I found her. She wasn't dead. Not yet. But close enough that death probably had her on speed dial. She was curled around something, arms like broken branches, face half covered by frost. Her skin was smooth and a strange violet hue, not the usual tones we catalog from the elderly refugees. I realized, then, she wasn't just cold. She was freezing for someone else. The bundle in her arms moved. Barely. A sound like a hiccup and a whimper escaped the thin wrappings. A child. Small. Frighteningly so. An alien in ways I didn't have the scientific vocabulary to explain but did have the gut reaction to recognize as not dangerous. Which is how I knew I was in trouble. Because I was about to do something very stupid. The smart move was to turn around, head back to the pod, and wait for a rescue that probably wasn't coming. The smart move was to leave them here, log the location, and pretend that I'd never seen the slow rise and fall of her chest or the flicker of heat in that tiny infant's breath. The smart move was survival. I didn't do the smart move. I took off my glove. My hand howled instantly. The air here doesn't just nip. It bites. Deep. But I pressed my palm to the side of her neck anyway. Still warm. Barely. I leaned in. "I'm going to move you," I whispered, because apparently I'd decided she spoke English. Or maybe I needed someone to hear me. Even if it was myself. She didn't respond. The child whimpered again. I unclipped the heating core from my suit's chest plate, the one thing keeping my torso above hypothermic levels, and pressed it into the wrapping around the child. My HUD flashed a warning about core integrity. I didn't care. I slung my emergency thermal blanket around them, lashed them to my back, and began climbing out of the ravine like a man possessed. Which I was. By stupidity. Compassion. Something. Maybe both. I made it halfway up before the snow betrayed me. The ledge collapsed under my foot and I fell, bounced once against the wall, and landed hard enough to make my vision go sideways. The child cried. AW. The heater was dying, and I was watching it like a man might watch a campfire burning through his last matchbook during a snowstorm, the kind of quiet despair that doesn't come with panic, just this numbing awareness that everything after this moment would be colder, and darker, and probably shorter than anyone wanted to admit. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor of the pod, next to the mother and the child, who still didn't have names and who still looked at me like I was something between a plague and a puzzle, except the kid was warming up now. Its skin had gone from a deathly bluish tone to something more alive, more flushed, more curious, even though it didn't speak, and it probably wouldn't for a while, assuming it survived and I hadn't just prolonged its suffering by dragging them both out of the ravine and into this aluminum coffin I called shelter. I checked the power readouts again, just in case the laws of physics had gotten drunk and decided to show me mercy. They hadn't. The internal battery was holding at 9%, and the external solar panels had about as much use on this sunless wasteland as a chocolate frying pan, which meant in less than 5 hours, the heat would fail, and we'd all get a front row seat to our slow but impressive transformation into alien popsicles. And the thing was, I knew how to fix it. I knew exactly how to give them another 12 hours of warmth, at least enough for the transmitter beacon to hopefully bounce off something passing within 50 light years and send a signal to someone, anyone, who wasn't currently in the middle of freezing to death. It just meant giving up my own core unit. Not the auxiliary, not the backup, but the last remaining heat cell embedded in my armor's chest rig, the one the suit needed to keep my blood from turning into glass, and the one thing standing between me and the kind of slow hypothermia that makes your fingers go numb before your brain figures out it should start screaming. So yeah, it was a choice, a stupid one by all reasonable metrics, and I was the only one around to vote on it, and I was really starting to resent democracy. I sat there, staring at the tiny kid who was now curled into its mother's side as if she were still a source of heat, even though her own core temperature hadn't stabilized yet. She was breathing shallow, barely, but her body was no longer clenched in that death throw grip she'd had in the ravine, which I supposed meant we were trending upward, if you ignored the oncoming doom. Then she opened her eyes slowly and blinked at me with a sort of confusion that says one of two things, either why are you here, or why am I still alive? I lifted my chin at her slightly and said, still think I'm a monster, which was a dumb thing to say, but cold makes you careless with words. She frowned, then flinched, her arms tightening around the child and her mouth moving to form a shape I didn't recognize. Her language had too many syllables and not enough vowels, like someone choking through snow melt. I said, not your enemy, and she didn't respond, which I guess was better than screaming or spitting, but still not exactly a rousing vote of confidence. I stood slowly, and the motion made her recoil again, just barely enough to notice, but I did notice, and it made my stomach twist a little, because I knew that flinch. I'd seen it from war survivors, from civilians who had seen soldiers enter their cities not as protectors, but as living siege weapons, and I hated that she saw me the same way. But I couldn't change that, not now, maybe not ever. What I could do was keep her alive. I turned away toward the equipment rack and knelt beside my suit, undoing the chest mount and tapping in the override sequence. The suit protested, because of course it did. It was designed to keep me alive, not to let me trade my life for two strangers who might still think I was here to harvest their organs. I muttered, override confirmed, authorization Kellier Delta 247, and the chest plate clicked open with a sound that reminded. The thing they never tell you in survival training is that saving someone's life does not automatically upgrade you to trustworthy in their eyes. You don't get a badge, or a free pass into their emotional safe zone, or even a thank you in whatever alien language their vocal cords are capable of producing. What you get is a pair of sharp, unblinking eyes staring at you every time you move, like maybe you're going to change your mind and finish the job that frostbite started, which is understandable, I guess, especially if you were raised believing that humans were a walking cautionary tale for what happens when evolution gives weapons to apes with emotional trauma. So I didn't blame her for watching me like I might sprout fangs and eat her baby. It just made things more awkward than they already were, which was saying something, considering we were stuck in a tin can on an ice rock with about 7 hours of power left and 0 working communication. I spent the next hour trying to jury-rig a half-dead translator module from my gear, not because I thought we'd be exchanging poetry anytime soon, but because pointing and grunting was starting to make me feel like the worst possible ambassador of my species, and if I was going to be misinterpreted, I wanted it to be because of syntax, not because I made the wrong face while handing her food. I cobbled together enough circuits and a voice modulator to get the machine to understand a few basic sounds, mostly nouns like water, food, danger, and my personal favorite, warm, which I tested by holding my palm over the heater and saying the word slowly while the machine chirped and spat out a flanged version of the same syllables. She watched me do this 4 times without reacting, then finally said something back into the device, which replied with a charming phrase, "No, eat my small one," which I took as both a warning and a miscommunication. I raised my hands, palms out, and said, "Not food, just man," then pointed to myself and added, "Name Dane Kelly." She looked at me as if that were the most suspicious name she'd ever heard, and said a single word that the translator interpreted as killer, to which I responded with a heavy sigh and said close, but not quite, which might not have helped my case much. After a long pause, she said another word, something like the rel or the relia. The translator chewed on it for a moment, and then proudly announced designation unknown, which was not remotely helpful, but I decided to go with the rel, since it was easier to say and at least gave me something to call her beyond the alien woman who doesn't trust me even though I saved her and her child and froze half my organs in the process. She didn't correct me, so I assumed that meant either yes, or I will allow this until I decide to bite you in your sleep. I pointed at the child, then at her, and asked name. The translator buzzed like a dying mosquito, then gave me nothing. She hesitated, then said a word so soft the device almost missed it. It sounded like soel, or maybe soul. The translator offered small light, which actually made me pause, because that was poetic in a way I didn't expect from someone who barely spoke to me and only recently stopped flinching when I moved too fast. I nodded and said softly, "Soel, good name." She didn't respond, but she looked at the child for a long moment, and something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the muscle memory of one, like her body remembered what hope felt like, even if her brain wasn't ready to unpack it yet. We sat in silence after that, a silence that felt less hostile than before, more like the kind of silence you share with someone when there's nothing to say but you still want to be near them. I used the quiet to run diagnostics on the emergency beacon and confirmed what I already suspected. The last transmission had bounced into deep space, and the unit didn't have enough power left for a second attempt, which meant the best we could hope for now was dumb luck and maybe a passing scout ship with ears open to aim. The heater gave a low whine sometime in the artificial dawn of our 4th shared morning, though to be fair, there was no actual morning on Elders 6. Just a marginally less dark gray that passed for optimism through the viewport. I was already awake by the time the noise started, because apparently my body had decided that sleep was for people who weren't trying to stave off frostbite and existential guilt at the same time. The woman, who still hadn't given me anything clearer than the role for her name, stirred slowly, her arms instinctively drawing the child in tighter even before she opened her eyes. A movement that had become so regular I was beginning to think it was muscle memory burned into her bones more than an act of thought. Her gaze flicked across the room, landed on me, and didn't waver, which was new. Usually, she gave me a few seconds to pretend I wasn't being scrutinized before dialing in a full cold stare treatment, but this time it was immediate, and something about the way her brow pulled slightly made me feel like a bug under glass. I nodded to her and said morning, which the translator cheerfully rendered into her language as rising cold, or possibly not dead yet, depending on how you parse the syntax. She didn't reply verbally, just stared for a few seconds longer, then finally broke eye contact to check the kid, who was miraculously still asleep, mouth half open, breathing shallow but steady. And for a moment, just a flicker, she looked not scared or angry but tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of rest, but from carrying a weight that no one helps you with and everyone pretends not to see. I recognized that kind of tired. I saw it in my own face every time I caught my reflection in the frosted metal wall of the pod. She finally spoke, her voice raspy but deliberate, and the translator hesitated before spitting out the sentence, "Humans do not save." We are not told this. I blinked, not entirely sure what to do with that sentence, because it wasn't a question or an accusation, just a plain flat statement, like saying water is wet or snow falls down. I replied slowly and said, "Not all humans. Some do, some don't." She frowned, not in confusion but in disagreement, and replied, "The teachings say your kind take worlds with fire. They arrive. They consume. They leave." And that was when I realized we were having a conversation not about me and her and the kid in this frozen tin can, but about every single thing she had ever been taught about humanity, and how it collided violently with the fact that I hadn't let her die in a ditch. I said, "Those teachings are not wrong, but they are not the whole story." She looked skeptical as hell and said, "You gave us heat, but you carry weapons. You gave us food, but you scan the perimeter while we sleep. You breathe with armor. You hide behind it and speak with masks." I wanted to laugh, not because she was wrong, but because everything she said was technically true and also painfully obvious, and if I were her, I would probably have drawn the exact same conclusions. So instead of defending myself, I said, "Yeah, that's fair. We're not easy to understand. Hell, most of the time, we don't understand ourselves." She didn't laugh, but her mouth twitched like maybe she wanted to, or at least recognized the absurdity in what I said. Then she leaned forward a little, just enough to make me sit up straighter, and said, "When you first touched me in the ravine, I thought I was being taken by a demon. The cold one we tell our children about. The one that eats the dying and keeps the bones warm." And I stared at her, thinking how oddly specific that myth sounded, before she added, "You were heat in the shape of a monster." I didn't say anything for a while, just let that hang in the stale warm air of the pod like a piece of history that had been waiting for someone to hear it, because I knew what it meant. It meant that for her, I wasn't a man or a soldier or a rescuer. I was an anomaly, a contradiction that didn't fit the story she'd been told. There was a moment that morning when the pod's outer shell stopped creaking from the cold, and I thought for half a second that maybe the storm outside had eased up. Then I realized it wasn't the planet being kinder, it was just that the wind had shifted directions, and the noise was now hitting the pod from a different angle, which meant that death was still on schedule, just changing its route. And yet, despite the impending ice doom, there was something different in the pod, something subtle, something warm that didn't come from a heater or a power cell or a thermal blanket, but from the way the roll had not moved away from me during the night, and from the way she now accepted the protein ration with a nod instead of a silent stare of suspicion, and from the way the child reached out one hand toward the edge of my coat, as if it recognized the shape of me now and maybe even liked it a little, or at least didn't find it terrifying anymore. And I think that's what got to me, more than the cold, more than the mission, more than the odds. It was that something had shifted inside this small broken family of three beings trapped in a death box, and somehow the edges were starting to soften. The frost was still there, but it didn't bite as hard, and I knew it had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with time and choice, and the way survival forces you to let go of fear when you realize the only thing between you and oblivion is another heartbeat, beating close enough to feel. And maybe I was being sentimental, or maybe the cold was getting to my brain, or maybe, just maybe, I was seeing the beginning of something bigger than rescue and statistics. Maybe I was seeing what it looked like when assumptions melted. I decided that if we were going to survive another few days, we needed more than rations and silence. We needed to talk, or something close to it. And so, I pulled out the busted translator again and started working on expanding its vocabulary, while the role watched me with a face that suggested curiosity was finally starting to outpace caution. I rewired a microprocessor, stole a circuit from my medical scanner, and used the power from a backup beacon I had stashed in my suit's thigh compartment. And somehow, after 3 hours and 3 burns to my fingers, I got it to start interpreting more than single-word sentences, which is how I learned that the role's full name was the Relivan of the Solari Drift, and that her people had once been astronomers, before the war came, before the skies turned to ash and the great dispersal shattered their families across half a dozen star systems, and that she had not spoken her full name in over a year, because there was no one left to hear it and no reason to say it. And that her child's name was in fact Soel, which meant little son in their language, and that she had named him that because she had hoped he would grow up somewhere warm and safe, and not under a sky of ice and waiting. And when I asked her what her people thought of humans, she didn't lie. She said we were noise and fire and teeth. We were the species that made things explode because they got in our way, and that when the first human ships arrived, they brought food but also soldiers and machines and contracts with too many clauses and not enough conscience, and that in the end what they remembered most was not the bombs or the treaties or the promises, but the look in our eyes, like we had already decided everything was ours and we were just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. I didn't argue, because she was right. We had done all that and more, and even if I wasn't personally responsible, my uniform bore the stains of 1,000 quiet sins left behind by missions that went wrong or never should have happened. And so I said nothing, and she didn't push me to. And instead, we sat there, sharing ration heat and broken grammar, and slowly the ice between us began to shift, not with a dramatic crack or sudden flood, but with a kind of movement that happens beneath the surface, unnoticed until one. The sound came just after the second meal ration, when I was sitting against the pod wall, checking the thermal seals on the last emergency wrap, while the roll dozed lightly with Soel's head tucked under her chin. The noise was not mechanical, which I might have been able to fix, and not animal, which would have scared me because what kind of life could survive out here, but geological, and that was worse because it meant the planet itself had started moving again, and nothing good ever came from a planet remembering it still had tectonics. The sound was a low, grinding vibration, deep and deliberate, like the groan of a glacier deciding it was done holding back its weight and wanted to see what the bottom of the world looked like. I felt it through the soles of my boots before I heard it, and when I looked up, the thin coating of frost on the pod's inner wall cracked down the middle in a slow, uneven line. That was how I knew the shelf we were parked on was no longer entirely stable. I stood up fast, not wanting to alarm anyone, and immediately my movement woke the roll, who bolted upright, scanning for threats. I held up both hands and said, not attack, just movement, and pointed at the wall, and the crack, and the floor, which was beginning to slope ever so slightly. Not enough to trip, but enough to tell you that in 5 hours this place was going to be at the bottom of something, and probably not in one piece. She stood slowly, her instincts sharp as always, and I explained as best I could that the shelf was shifting, that the pod was in danger, and that we had to leave. When I said the word leave, she looked at me like I had just told her we were going to walk naked into space, but I nodded firmly and said, yes, leave, outside now, and she shook her head and said, too cold, Soel cannot. I said, yes, cold, but death colder, and that seemed to translate, because she stopped arguing and started packing, or at least wrapping the kit in every scrap of fabric we had. I dug through the storage to find the last functioning exosleeve unit and wrapped it around my arms, so I could carry them without losing circulation. I stripped the dead battery from my armor and shoved the last charge pack into the emergency thermal rig, and I knew it would not be enough, but it would be more than nothing. Then I opened the pod door, and the world punched me in the face with a wind so cold it made memory brittle. The snow whipped sideways, not falling but attacking, and the visibility was maybe 10 meters, which would have been useful if the nearest safe zone had been 10 meters away, which it was not. I tapped my visor to bring up the topographic map, which was spotty at best and outdated at worst, But it showed a rock formation about 400 meters east, with a hollow that might have once been a lava tube or a wind-eroded cave. I marked it with a beacon ping, and pointed to it, and said, "Shelter," and the girl just nodded, her arms already wrapped around Soel, her shoulders set like a soldier going to war. I admired her then more than I had before, because it takes a special kind of strength to walk into certain death with a child and no guarantee, and still do it because standing still is worse. I led the way, carving a path through snow that reached my thighs in places, and even with a thermal suit and a modified heat band around my chest, I felt my core temp start to slide. I knew I had less than an hour before motor control would start slipping, and I pushed harder because the cave was our only chance, and every second was alone with bad interest. When I looked back and saw the girl following close, her feet uncertain but steady, and the child tucked into her like a flame, I realized I was not just dragging two people out of the cold, I was dragging myself into something I had never planned for and maybe didn't deserve. We reached the halfway point when the ridge behind us groaned like a living thing, and then split with a sound that didn't echo so much as smother the air. I turned in time to see the pod sink side out. The heater pulsed like a dying heartbeat, a slow, rhythmic glow that flickered more often than not. Every time it faded for half a second longer than expected, I felt my chest tighten, not from the cold, but from the growing certainty that we were running out of time. Not in the poetic sense, not in the big, existential, maybe the universe has a plan kind of way, but in the literal, mechanical, death is knocking and we have no bolts to slide in its face way. The cave had given us temporary shelter, but not salvation. It was a hole in a frozen rock, and even if it kept the wind out, it couldn't keep the temperature from trying to steal us, cell by cell, heartbeat by heartbeat. I watched the girl wrap Soel tighter in the emergency cloth, and I saw the edges of her fingers starting to take on that gray tone that no amount of optimism could paint over. I knew then that waiting was no longer a strategy, it was a slow capitulation, and if we didn't do something now, we would become a story no one ever heard. I checked the time-stamped logs on my visor and confirmed what I already knew. The last broadcast had gone out 36 hours ago, and nothing had come back. No ping, no echo, no acknowledgement, which meant one of two things: either no one had heard it, or someone had and decided we weren't worth the detour. I wasn't sure which one was worse. I stood slowly, my joints stiff and my breath already coming in short gusts that turned to fog immediately, and I opened the side panel of my armor where I had stashed the backup relay. A thin piece of technology, barely the size of my palm, and designed to do exactly one thing: shoot a signal as far and as hard as it could, in one last scream for help. I held it in my hand for a moment, turning it over and thinking about the charge pack it would drain completely the moment it activated. Thinking about the fact that it had one chance to find a satellite, or a buoy, or a passing drone, and if it missed that shot, then it was dead, and so were we. Thinking about the fact that once I activated it, we would lose the last auxiliary battery tied to the heating grid, and that meant the heater would stop entirely, and the cave would become just another hole in the ground where we died quietly and together. So it wasn't just a button, it was a choice. The girl looked at me and didn't say anything, just watched my face, and then glanced at the relay, and then back at me. I could tell she understood, even without translation, because desperation doesn't need grammar. I crouched beside her and said, "One chance, signal may bring help, or may not, but if it works, someone will know we are here." She stared at me for a long time, and then said, "What if it fails?" I said, "Then we fail warm and quiet," and she actually smiled. Not a big smile, not a hopeful one, but a small, tired one that said she appreciated the honesty. I nodded once, then turned and walked to the entrance of the cave, where the snow still drifted like ghost breath, and the sky overhead was a flat, endless gray. I placed the relay on a rock, set the targeting beacon to wideband, and locked in every frequency I could remember from my training cycles, and some I probably made up in the haze of near hypothermia. Then I pulled the tab and activated the core. The relay lit up red, then blue, then a single sharp green flash, and then it hummed, a low mechanical whine that rose until it felt like it was shaking the stone under my boots. Then it screamed, Not audibly, not in any way a person could hear, but in signal and code and pulse. A message meant for machines and stars, a cry in a language older than our war, a declaration of presence and vulnerability. It said, "We are here, we are dying, we are worth saving." Then it burned itself out and went cold. I watched the light die and stood there for another minute, my eyes scanning the sky for any sign of movement, knowing full well that even if someone heard us, we wouldn't know for hours, maybe longer, and that waiting was still all we had left. I went back inside the cave and saw the Rojo. The ship came at dawn, if you could call it that, since Eldra's 6 didn't do sunlight in any conventional sense. The sky just shifted from pitch black to a slightly less angry gray. But when the shadow passed over the cave mouth, it was undeniable, and different, and mechanical, and real, and I knew immediately it wasn't human. That mattered more than I wanted to admit, because it meant someone out there had been listening, even if it wasn't one of ours. Also, because it meant I was about to find out whether or not I was going to be shot in the head by a species whose last known interaction with Earth involved a trade negotiation that ended with the ambassador's chair exploding underneath him, and an apology note made out of bioluminescent fungus. I crouched near the cave opening, visor dimmed, heartbeat climbing, pressure building, and the Roll crouched beside me without speaking, her eyes narrow, her arms tight around Soel, and her body tense in a way that suggested this was not a normal ship. This was not one of hers, not anymore, not since the fall, and the ice, and the silence. The vessel landed not far from us, slowly and carefully, legs extending like the roots of some great metal tree, and the hatch hissed open with a sound that somehow managed to be both comforting and ominous. Then they stepped out, tall, thin, armored in iridescent plates of silver and dark blue, with helmets that gleamed like oil under storm light, and weapons that hung from their backs with the casual confidence of people who had never needed to aim twice. The Roll inhaled sharply and said one word I did not understand, but the translator interpreted as guardians, which I assumed was a formal title, not a compliment. When they saw us, the lead figure raised a hand and made a complex gesture, which the translator barely managed to convert into stand down, civilian reclamation protocol. I stood slowly, hands visible, weapon holstered, visor up, and said, "I am Lieutenant Dane Kelly, Earth Rescue Corps. I found survivors and requested extraction." The leader paused as if digesting that, then said, "Humans are not authorized for intervention in Solari matters." I said, "Nobody told me that when I signed up for this frozen death trap." Then the Roll stepped forward, and immediately the tone changed, because suddenly they were looking at her and not me, and there was recognition in their stance, and also surprise, and maybe something darker. The leader said, "Identification," and the Roll replied with her full name, voice steady and proud, and something in the soldiers shifted slightly, a stiffness like their boots had sunk too deep in the snow and were trying not to admit it. One of them stepped forward and said, "You are listed among the perished," and the Roll said, "Then update your list," and that might have been the most Solari thing I had ever heard. The leader looked at me, then back at her, and said, "Why is the human here?" The Roll said, "He saved us," and the leader replied with a silence that was not approval and not confusion, but that special kind of pause people use when they are recalculating the moral math of a situation and not liking the result. I stepped forward and said, "I gave them my last heat cell, I carried them out of a collapsing ridge, I called the signal that brought you here, and all I want is to get them somewhere safe. You can leave me here, or shoot me, or drag me through an inquiry board later, but right now this is not about politics, or territory, or jurisdiction. This is about a mother and a child who do not deserve to freeze to death because your database was out of date." The leader stared at me for a long moment, and then said, "Your words are loud," which I took as a compliment, or at least not an arrest warrant. Then they said, "You will accompany us for debrief," and the Roll immediately moved between us, her arms flared in a protective arc, and her voice sharper than I had ever heard it. She said, "If he does not go, I do not go, and neither does the child." The soldiers looked at her, and then at each other, and I knew this was no. The room they put me in was warm, in the way a hospital bed is warm, just enough to keep the flesh from stiffening too fast, not enough to pretend you are anywhere close to home. The lighting was dim, with that artificial blue tint that made everything look sterile and temporary, and the walls were smooth, with no seams and no visible controls, like they wanted you to feel safe but not empowered. I knew a cell when I saw one, even if it had a comfortable chair and something that looked suspiciously like teas sitting on a tray too neatly to not be a test. I didn't touch it, not because I thought they'd poison me, but because I was too tired to pretend I wanted to play games. I sat there for what felt like hours, though time inside places like this is more theory than science, and I counted the seconds between footfalls outside the door and the soft hiss of the internal ventilation, and waited for someone to stop pretending I wasn't being watched. Finally, someone did. The door dissolved, and a woman walked in, or at least I think she was a woman. Her frame was slight, and her face was symmetrical in a way that only engineered genetics or very lucky evolution could manage, and her eyes were silver, not metaphorically but literally. She carried a data slate like a weapon, and when she sat across from me, she smiled the way people do when they want you to know the smile is there by choice, not by instinct. She said, "I am Analyst Riven, and I am here to ask you some questions." I said, "You could have just asked them without the room and the tea and the suspense." She said, "We are not interrogating you, Lieutenant Kelly, we are assessing the context of your involvement." I said, "That is a very polite way to say you think I might be lying." She said, "We are open to all possibilities." I said, "So am I, but I like starting with the possibility that everyone here is very bad at hospitality." She did not laugh, but she tilted her head like she was cataloging my sarcasm for later analysis, and said, "Your transmission was received by a Solari patrol vessel on a civilian monitoring route. You used frequencies designated as obsolete by your own people." I said, "That explains why Earth never picked up the call." She said, "Why did you use them?" I said, "Because they work, and because the cold doesn't care about protocol, and because I was desperate, and desperate people get creative." She wrote something on the slate without breaking eye contact, and said, "You understand that your presence on Solari held ground is in violation of interspecies protocol." I said, "I also understand that had I not violated that protocol, the role and her son would be dead." She said, "But that was not your mission." I said, "No, my mission was to find survivors, and she was one, and that makes her my responsibility." She said, "So you acted on your own volition, without directive from command?" I said, "Yes." She said, "That is irregular." I said, "So is surviving in a cave at 30 below, with no heat and an alien child breathing like he's negotiating with death." She said, "You are very emotional for a soldier." I said, "I'm not a soldier anymore. I'm a man who got tired of watching people die, and I don't care what species they are." That made her pause for the first time, like something in my voice scratched past the armor of logic and into the soft part of consideration. Then she said, "The role has submitted a formal statement on your behalf." I said, "Did she lie?" She said, "She said you gave your body heat, your food, and your protective gear to ensure the survival of her and her child." I said, "That's true." She said, "She also said that you never once attempted to claim them as assets or prisoners, or demand anything in return." I said, "That's also true." She said, "She found that unusual." I said, "It shouldn't be." She said, "She also said you spoke to the child as if he were your own." I said, "He didn't know the difference, and sometimes neither did I." That made her look down for a moment, and I wondered if she had children, or if her face was just doing a good job pretending it remembering. They didn't release me, so much as quietly stop locking the door, which I suppose is how you apologize when you're an interstellar civilization built on suspicion and quiet regret. I didn't ask for an explanation, because the look on Analyst Riven's face when she returned without the data slate and simply said "You may leave," was enough to tell me that the committee had met and decided I was no longer worth holding, or maybe they had just run out of things they could charge me with without making the entire ship feel like a tribunal. I didn't care either way, because the moment I stepped out of that room, I walked straight to the observation bay, and there they were. The role, standing with her arms folded in that way she did when she was thinking hard about something she wasn't ready to say, and so Elle, curled up on a padded bench, sleeping like the world had finally stopped asking him to earn his place in it. When she saw me, she didn't smile, and I didn't expect her to, but she nodded, and that was enough. I sat beside her, and we watched the stars slip past the window in a long, slow dance of light and distance, and she said quietly, "They are sending us to Station 3 for resettlement. They say we will be given space and supplies and a name in the records again." I said good, and she said they asked if I wanted to return to the drift, and I said no. I said, "Was that hard?" and she said yes, but not wrong. We sat in silence again, the kind that doesn't need filling, and she looked at me finally and said, "You are not coming with us, are you?" I said no, and she asked why, and I said because I think if I stay, someone's going to try to turn this into a policy or a story or a footnote, and I don't want to be a footnote. She said, "What do you want?" and I said I want to go back out there and find the next cave, the next mother, the next broken system that forgot someone was worth saving. She didn't argue, and she didn't try to convince me, and that's why I knew she understood better than anyone ever had. Then Soel woke up and looked at me and said Dean, not quite my name, but close enough, and reached out and hugged me, and that was the first time I cried in front of anyone since my brother's funeral, and I didn't care who saw it. Thurl said, "We will tell him your story," and I said, "Don't make me a hero, just make me real," and she said, "That is harder," and I said, "I know." The next day, I boarded a transport and headed back toward the edge of nowhere, and they headed inward toward a new life, and I didn't look back, not because I didn't care, but because I wanted the memory of them walking forward, not standing still. I filed my report with Earth Command and didn't wait for a response, and I signed the debrief with the truth and no excuses. When they offered me a medal, I told them to melt it down and use it to patch the holes in the rescue budget, and when they offered me a promotion, I told them to give it to someone who needed rank more than purpose. When they told me to stop talking to the press, I told them the press hadn't asked me yet, but thanks for the reminder. Then I bought a ship, a small, ugly thing with mismatched plating and an AI that thought sarcasm was a primary language, and I named it the Soul Light and painted a little flame on the hull. I started running routes through the forgotten zones, the cold places, the broken stations, the refugee camps that no one listed on the maps anymore. At first, it was just deliveries and scans and the occasional evac, but then I started finding others, people who had done what I did in small ways. A medic who stayed behind during a flood, a miner who shared his air with a stowaway child, a teacher who walked 10 kilometers every week to teach 3 kids in a tent. None of them thought they were heroes, and none of them had medals, and all of them lit something in the places they touched. I realized then that it wasn't just about heat or rescue, it was about fire, the kind that spreads because it refuses to go out. People started calling us something, not official, not sanct. In the end, no monument was built, no treaty signed, no parade marched for the man who gave his heat to strangers and walked back into the cold. What remained instead was a name, passed quietly from one survivor to another, a symbol etched onto ruined outposts and painted on cargo hulls, a circle with a flame, not for conquest, not for pride, but for warmth given freely when there was nothing left to give. And sometimes, that's all it takes, one reckless human, one impossible choice, one spark in the dark, to remind the galaxy that compassion isn't weakness, and survival isn't just breathing, it's choosing to burn a little brighter for someone else. And if that fire spreads, if others see it and carry it, then maybe, just maybe, the cold doesn't win. And that is enough. That will always be enough.